Hey all, thanks for clicking in. I thought I'd share with you a 74 millimeter Victorinox. And if you're not familiar with the 74 millimeter line, they're about 3 inches, and this is how they compare to a classic, which they are much like. Classics being the 58 millimeters, about 2¼ inches. And just for size comparison, there's your Spartan, which is 91 millimeters. So Victorinox classifies, their 74 millimeter knives as small knives, and it's kind of a limited line. They only have 4 knives currently. What you're looking at there is the Executive, and I'll show you the tools here in a minute. They also have an Ambassador, which has the Celador scales. This is a 5-tool knife, not including the scale tools, and the Ambassador just 3. And they also have a money clip and a cigar cutter version, which are A-locks. Now, the Executive, you don't really see it that often. I think the reason is it's kind of expensive for a smaller knife. It retails for $47.50, whereas a Tinker or Spartan retails for $30. So they're expensive knives. The Executive is anyway, because of you'll see has some pretty sophisticated tools. They're just small, and I don't know how many people want to pay that much for that small of a knife. But it's called an Executive because the idea is that it's small and it's thin, so I guess it does not show up in dress clothes. It's not going to make a bulge in your vest pocket or your suit pocket or something like that. Yeah, so the Executive, it's got several tools, but one thing that it has that no other Swiss Army knife has or ever has had is this orange peeler. So this is what Victorinox calls an orange peeler, and you will only find it now and in the past on a 74 millimeter Executive. So I think that's pretty cool. The idea here is that you cut the rind of the orange, top to bottom, I guess, and then peel it off in segments. I've not tried it. I doubt I will. I don't have an orange, but it's sharp. It's serrated here at the end, and again, that's a pretty sophisticated little tool. The other thing that currently sets the Executive apart is that currently it's the only Victorinox tool to have, knife rather, to have this cross-hatched fingernail file. In the past, you could get that on a classic. If you see a cross-hatched file pattern on a classic fingernail file, that classic's probably from the 60s or earlier. And what I'm talking about here is, here back to your more modern classic. All right. So the fingernail file on a classic and all other Victorinox knives right now has this softer, kind of a pebbled fingernail file. It's not nearly as aggressive. It keeps a finish better. You may notice that, I've polished this knife and clean that up the best I can, but once they cut that stainless steel like that for that file, it gets tarnished and corroded, and there's really just no cleaning it up that I have found. I mean, you can get rust and stuff out of it, but you can't get that darkness out of it. And if anybody knows how to do that, shy of acid or something, let me know. But one other thing I've noticed about this is a vintage Executive from the 60s or early 70s, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But one very subtle difference I noticed between this knife and current Executives, which also have this cross-cut file, is that the cross-cut file in the current Executives seems to be squarish, lines cut up and down and straight back and forth, whereas this has a diagonal second cut. And it also comes almost all the way down to the hilt of the knife, to the handle of the knife, whereas the modern ones stop short about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. That's the fingernail tool. They also have scissors. Executives have scissors. And this is a vintage knife with a single leaf scissor spring and the screw pivot. And that's going to date the knife, you know, pre-1975. But the best way to date the knife is on the tang stamp on the large blade. Here we go. Yeah, so this knife has a tang stamp that reads Hoffritz Switzerland stainless. And Hoffritz, if you don't know, maybe you probably do, but you know, you see the name Hoffritz on a lot of Swiss Army knives. And they were Germans that came over and started a retail business in New York in 1932. And they were big importers of knives from Solingen, Germany, and Swiss Army knives. And they actually at one time had up to like 200 stores around the country. They sold so many Swiss Army knives over here that they got their own tang stamp, and or they would have their name, you know, laser etched in the blade, or you would see, you know, the Hoffritz hot stamped here in white, or maybe even inlaid. So common to see Hoffritz knives. Hoffritz went bankrupt in 1974. And you know, closed their stores. Their name was bought by some company, Lifetime Hone, H-O-A-N Corporation, and you can still find kitchen utensils with the Hoffritz name sold by this Lifetime brands. But the main way to kind of date this knife is on the other side, the tang stamp Victoria. No, not Victoria stainless or anything else, just Victoria with that squatty little crossbow there. That was used from 1943 to 1970 by Victorinox. So that, the fact that the scissors have the single leaf spring and the screw pivot, you know, tells me this knife is from the 60s or early 70s. Why isn't it earlier? Well, if it were earlier than the 60s, it would probably have exposed rivets. Let's get this back down here. In addition to the big blade, the Executive has a small blade. Very small blade. Smallest blade probably you'll find on a Victorinox. I might be wrong about that, but so the other models, you know, I talked about the Ambassador. It looks a lot like this, but it just doesn't have the small blade and the orange peeler. They do come with toothpick and tweezers, except for the Alox models, the money clip and the cigar cutter, and with tweezers. Now this one came missing tweezers. If it had the original tweezers, they would be an aluminum tipped tweezer. But modern day 74mm and 58mm Victorinox knives share the same tweezers and toothpicks, small. So if you're ever buying replacements for any of those, you know, you want to get the small size. They fit both of the knives. And I just took this out of a classic that I had and put it in here. Now, it was a tight fit, and when I got to the plastic end, you know, obviously something has changed between the 60s and the way they make these Ambassadors now, because it really wouldn't go in until I trimmed some of the plastic off. It fits now. Yeah, so these knives, they usually come with a key ring. I think originally the Executive did not, and it was called the Companion. But that name's now used for a 58mm model. And I'm not really sure how long this Executive model has been around. I read somewhere like 60 plus years. But I know it's based on the same patent, 1952 patent, that the Classic is based on, which was the patent there, you know, what allowed tools on each side coming off of the same spring. And but you know, the Classic's been around a lot longer than 1952. So I'm not really sure if you know anything about that, when Victorinox started the Executive or the 74mm line. If you could leave that in the comments, that would be very helpful. Also, there was a director. There was this model that had stainless steel tools called a director. And those are probably pretty hard to get, pretty rare. These are still pretty affordable. You know, that's one neat thing about the smaller sizes, the classics, and I'm finding these 74 millimeter knives. If if you want a vintage Swiss Army knife, here's a knife that, believe it or not, is 40 to 50 years old, and costs less, even in this condition, than a new one. Pretty neat. Okay, well, I'm going to be selling this on my Etsy shop. If you're interested in owning it, you might want to go there and take a look at it. I appreciate you watching, and have fun collecting.